Logging railroads were important and valuable tools that provided the transportation of logs and pulpwood from landings deep in the forest to mills at railheads or points of transfer to larger railroads, which completed the delivery of the grist for the lumber and paper mills. Though the Connecticut and Merrimack rivers provided the means of transportation of the early drives of timber to the ocean, and vast volumes of wooden logs were driven out of the upper reaches on these rivers and their tributaries, it's safe to say that more logs rode out of the woods of northern New Hampshire on logging railroads than were ever driven out in the streams or waterways of the North Woods.
There was a time when a visitor to this area could still be greeted on all sides by rich stands of timber, mostly deep green spruce and fir. But then the iron horse invaded the mountains, and for over 50 years the region experienced large-scale logging operations, unparalleled in North Country history for their intensity. Across the breadth of New Hampshire's mountain country, an exciting spectacle of logging unfolded with all the vigor and color known in western regions. This was an era dominated by hard-driving lumber kings. It was a time of large fortunes made and lost, a time of ruthless tree slaughter, and a time of fires unequaled before or since. It was also a time of grave concern and intentional opposition by thoughtful men and women whose efforts finally helped bring about the protection of this area through the passage of the Weeks Act and the eventual creation of the White Mountain National Forest. Go anywhere in the backwoods of these White Mountains, these deep, mysterious hills, still seldom visited by man in many places, and you will find reminders. The high, flat meadow clearings still bear evidence of the presence of old logging camps. Portions of important roads throughout the mountains were built on the base of old logging railroad beds. Logging roads are still well etched on the sides of high ridges of Lafayette, Lincoln, Hancock, Carrigan, and many other slopes. And in many valleys, your feet will get to know paths that the railroads used to take away the mountain's cloak, as many of today's hiking trails follow the network of routes established by those early railroads. By the mid-1870s, the cinder-belching engines had reached the mountains from the outside world and had begun their invasion. Rail lines came into the hills from 3 different directions. From the south via Concord and Plymouth, with the Boston, Concord, and Montreal and Pemigewasset Valley Railroads, both of which later became part of the Boston and Maine. From the southeast, the Portland and Ogdensburg Railroad, later the Maine Central, and from the north and east, the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, later the Grand Trunk. Once these links from a lumber-hungry America to the mountains were established, the scene was set for smaller logging railroads to radiate throughout the hills, and the drama of the timber cutting could begin to unfold. Developments in papermaking, which allowed for softer wood to be used, fueled the fire more than ever before.
The most popular and durable engine manufacturer used in the mountains were Baldwins, built by the Baldwin Company of Philadelphia. A common wheel arrangement, the 2-4-2, was seen often in the White Mountains. These had a wheelbase of 2 lead trucks, 4 drivers, and 2 following trucks. The silhouette of the Baldwin is very compact and distinct, as the engine had its circular water tank directly over the steam boiler. This construction served 2 purposes. It preheated the water to be converted to steam, thus conserving fuel, and it placed the weight of that water directly over the drive wheels, giving them better traction. However, despite such improvements over earlier styles, mortality rate for Baldwins was very high. Due to their somewhat motley and economic construction, logging railroads relied on sturdy, well-built locomotives to provide motive power to their operations. However, these locomotives were often industrial in nature compared to the larger locomotives seen on mainline railroads. The Climax was less prevalent than the Shay in the White Mountains, although heavily used on logging railroads in other parts of the country. Made by the Climax Manufacturing Company of Corry, Pennsylvania, this engine was specifically designed for the tight, winding valleys of Pennsylvania. Extremely maneuverable, The climax featured two angled drive shafts linked to the cylinders on both sides of the front of the boiler and connected to a central drive shaft. This arrangement caused the engine to move in a jerking motion, which universally earned it the nickname herky-jerky. Although less common in the White Mountains, climaxes were used on the Beebe River Railroad in Campton and by the Conway Lumber Company. Beebe River Railroad, number 6, which you can see here still in use today at Clark's Trading Post, was later sold to the East Branch and Lincoln Railroad and ended its logging career there. It is one of the only climax locomotives still operating in the world and has spent its entire life in the White Mountains.
During this era of enormous harvesting of timber, the logging railroad came into its heyday, accelerating the process of using timber resources, and all the while contributing to the lore and legend of logging history. Between 1893 and 1917, J.E. Henry and his sons built, operated, and maintained more miles of logging railroad and hauled out more timber than any of their competitors in the White Mountains. The logging railroad became visible simply because the proprietors obliged the curious public by running special trains and accommodations for their pleasure and adventure. This brought in writers and photographers who in turn brought to public attention the ways of the woods for the enlightenment of countless readers.
The East Branch and Lincoln Railroad is the one logging line which today is still closer to more memories and deeper to more hearts than all other White Mountain carriers put together. The esteem came primarily from its masters, the lumber barons, but it was also held in high regard by itinerants of all types, lumberjacks from all walks of life, foresters, peddlers, trappers, fishermen, conservationists, hunters, excursionists, and even prime critics. Not only were Henry's woods the largest single tract in the White Mountains to be logged by rail, but its valleys were deeper, its shoulders richer, and its spruce and fir plentiful.
J.E. Henry and his family, after logging previously in the Zeeland Valley, moved into the Lincoln area in 1892. The Boston, Concord, and Montreal had already reached North Woodstock, a mile or so away, where several grand hotels were located. And Lincoln itself was not very striking at that time. The construction of the East Branch and Lincoln Railroad started quite slowly, and it stretched towards the forest. Eventually, this line would total more than 50 miles of track and spurs up and down the rich valleys that extend to the east of Lincoln like fingers stemming from a hand, proving to be as fruitful to the Henrys as a major rail empire would be to its corporate owners. Certainly, compared to the other New Hampshire logging railroads, this one was a whole rail system and not just a single operating line. Under its attentive management, the East Branch and Lincoln became quite a systematic operation. Every Tuesday and Friday, whole trains brought welcome loads of supplies to the waiting camp foremen and their men. In between these main supply days, the ever-present flat car next to the engine carried a wonderful confusion of incidentals: food, mail, axes, steam equipment, people, and dynamite. The unique operation of excursion trains was instituted in the summers by the Henrys once they saw that they would pay their way. One distinction for the East Branch and Lincoln should always be remembered is the high-grade construction of its main line of tracks and the care given to them. Unlike the case of their earlier and crooked line up the Zeeland Valley, on the East Branch and Lincoln, Henry and his sons house-kept well on their solid right-of-way, particularly on the main stem between Lincoln and North Fork Junction. This is still very much evident along the 4-mile section of today's Kankamongus Highway, from Lincoln to the Wilderness Trail, and on many stretches between the latter spot and the Stillwater. There are some amazingly long stretches of straight track between Camps 4 and 7, and especially on the long flat between Franconia Brook and Camp 16 clearing at the Bond Cliff Trail. Past, present, and future hikers in these areas stride along easily where Henry's laborers sweated profusely for his avenue to fortune. Not only were the roadbeds well constructed, but the bridges and trestles were as well, models of good engineering under the Henry management. Today, most of these have since dropped into the abysses that they crossed. The most unusual thing about Henry's logging camps was their portability. Not long after their forces started east out of Lincoln, the Henrys devised a method by which their camp buildings could be put together and then taken apart and moved by train in sections from one location to the next in order to follow the cutting operations. Each permanent camp consisted of an assorted set of structures. Odd bits of many of these camps still litter the back country of the East Branch. It is time well spent to poke around in any that you might pass for interesting relics and mysterious clues of another dramatic day.
But surely the most dramatic train to ever operate on the Pemi ran on May 13, 1907. Fire, a constant companion to life in the North Country, broke out in Lincoln early in the afternoon when sparks from one of Henry's logging engines landed in a stack of hay adjacent to one of the company barns. The blaze was quickly out of control and fast approaching conflagration proportions. It was obvious that outside help was needed or the village would be completely wiped out. An SOS call was sent to Concord, and a special train bearing apparatus of the Concord Fire Department raced the 72 miles to Lincoln, where the equipment aided in saving the town from complete destruction. A contemporary account stated that the run was made in a remarkable time of 55 minutes. This was probably a gross exaggeration, but no doubt the pall of smoke, which was readily visible in Plymouth, spurred the engine crew on to greater deeds, and the run up the branch must have been an awesome sight to behold. Henry's operation became part of the Parker Young Company later on, which itself owned the Beebe River Railroad in nearby Campton. With its forests exhausted after World War II, Parker Young Company ceased operations with the sale in 1946 to Marcalis Manufacturing Company of what remained of Henry's plant, premises, and railroad. 2 years later, in 1948, the remaining trackage of the old East Branch and Lincoln east of Lincoln was pulled up, and the Granite State's biggest logging railroad was no more. The complexion of the valley began to change dramatically in the 1930s. The Depression and the decline in lumbering had resulted in the closing of several mills. Overnight cabins, gas stations, and roadside restaurants began to appear on U.S. Route 3 north from Plymouth, as automobile traffic became the dominant factor in the region's economy. At the end of World War II, only the mills at Livermore Falls, Beebe River, and Lincoln were still in operation, and only one logging railroad, the EB&L, remained. In a handful of years, with the area's major industry gone, the focus of life switched almost completely to tourism, which, ironically, had been a major reason to build railroad lines to the White Mountains in the first place.
However, the paper mill in Lincoln, later part of the Franconia Paper Company, continued to operate and was served by the East Branch in Lincoln for plant switching into the 1960s. Steam locomotives like Baldwin No. 5 continued to work the mill in Lincoln until 1965, long enough to be met by northbound Boston and Maine fan trips using Budd rail diesel cars, or RDCs. Only the paper mill at Lincoln, owned by the Franconia Paper Company since 1950, justified the continued 6-day-a-week freight operations of local train CO1, which departed Concord at the ungodly hour of 4 o'clock a.m. This service remained fairly consistent for many years and consisted of 2 separate trains and crews. Northbound, it would arrive in Lincoln in the early afternoon and turn its train over to the paper company switcher. Its southbound counterpart would depart Lincoln at 10 o'clock a.m. and arrive in Concord early in the evening. Diesels supplanted the K8 Class 280s in the early 50s, but there was no alteration of scheduling until the 1960s. At that time, the service was rearranged to provide for two different locals, one running north from Concord and the other south from Lincoln. They would exchange trains at Lakeport or Ashland, and then each would return to their home terminal. In late 1968, the Lincoln job was eliminated, and C13, as the remaining local was designated, would make the entire round trip from Concord to Lincoln 3 days a week. For a couple of years in the late 60s, there was also a Sunday round trip which ran as a third-class train. In June of 1970, the very bottom fell out of the branch's business north of Plymouth. The mill at Lincoln was forced to shut down because of its inability to comply with anti-pollution regulations. Local C13 would turn back at Plymouth, except on few occasions when it was needed to drop a car at Beebe River in Campton. During the winter of 1970 and 1971, the local did go to Lincoln once in a while with coal for the powerhouse, but the future for the branch was indeed bleak. In the summer of 1971, there came a reprieve, however. The mill reopened, anti-pollution requirements apparently having been satisfied, and C13 again rolled north with raw material and back down with finished product. But this reprieve was short-lived. The mill shut down again in April of 1972, apparently this time for good, and the branch north of Beebe River was placed out of service. It seemed the time of the Pemmy branch had come to an end. But there still was hope. In 1973, the mill was sold to local interests, who announced that it would reopen, this time under the name of Profile Paper Company. For a brief moment, it appeared that the branch had won another reprieve, but it was not to be. Heavy rains in late June culminated in yet another flood on the 30th in the Pemigewasset River Valley. Major washouts occurred south of Ashland, just north of Plymouth, and in several places in Campton and Thornton. With that, the railroad threw in the towel. The White Mountain branch was placed out of service north of Meredith, and it was announced that no repairs would be undertaken to fix the damage or place the branch back in service. Early in 1975, the Profile Paper Company was forced to shut down. The company's failure was in no small part attributed to the lack of rail service. The governor of the state of New Hampshire, Meldrum Thompson Jr., immediately announced that he would pledge the state's support in reopening the branch north of Meredith, and he even went further. Anticipating that approval to abandon the entire line north from Concord was inevitable, he announced that he would recommend that the state of New Hampshire purchase the entire right-of-way from the Boston and Maine and engage a private party to operate the road instead. This proposal received enthusiastic backing from numerous businessmen in the Lakes region who had feared the loss of all rail service north of Concord. The New Hampshire legislature accepted the governor's recommendation, and acting under a law enacted in 1974, the state legally took over the right-of-way on October 30th, 1975. The Wolfboro Railroad became the designated operator of the line, operating it as their central division between Concord and Lincoln. They did the honors until early 1977, when the Goodwin Railroad took over, operated by Weaver Brothers Construction in Bow, New Hampshire. For a time, freight service to the mill in Lincoln continued, but the mill saw its doors close for good on June 11, 1980. Under state ownership, the White Mountain branch became home to the Hobo Railroad in 1987, which began operating tourist excursion rides along the Pemigewasset River. In 2023, the company was bought by Patriot Rail and rebranded the Granite State Scenic. The line survives intact from Concord to Lincoln to this day.
And so the big railroad to the White Mountains survived. But what of the logging railroads? Well, they were all gone by the mid-1950s, save for the East Branch in Lincoln, which had been whittled down to the paper mill trackage. But the Clark family, whose Eskimo sled dog ranch in North Woodstock had been a fixture of the region since 1928, would intervene. The Clark brothers, Edward and Murray, began salvaging what steam locomotives remained in the White Mountains and had them moved to their ranch for display. Soon, a short track was constructed, allowing for tourist rides and interpretations of logging railroading. Construction on the railroad began in 1955, and the first train ride was on July 30th, 1958. By 1964, the Clark brothers had crossed the Pemmy River with a wooden-covered bridge dismantled in Montpelier, Vermont, and reassembled here. The Clarks then laid track on the other side of the river, on a right-of-way which had once been the old Johnson branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad. This branch, abandoned in 1918, left Lincoln and ran to a mill up near Indian Head. The White Mountain Central Railroad, as the Clarks called it, finally terminated just under the overpasses of Interstate 93. The logging railroads of the White Mountains hauled untold amounts of timber from these hills and made the fortunes of men like J.E. Henry. For a half-century, they delved deeper into the untouched wilderness than any stagecoach or Grand Hotel ever had. Their efforts led to the White Mountain Natural Forest, a world-class natural gem which will forever preserve the sanctity of these mysterious deep woods. The logging railroads of the White Mountains, long distant today, have been consigned to history and are the subject of some very fascinating reading by authors like Francis Belcher and Bill Gove.
And if you happen to be trekking through the forests of North Woodstock or Lincoln, keep your ears peeled, for you may just hear the shrill whistle of Climax Number 6 echoing off the Pemigewasset River and through those pages of history.